Chapter 5, Tissues. This is the last chapter that we're going to cover before we start talking about the organ systems. Primary objectives. We're going to learn what tissues, organs, and organ systems are. We're going to define and locate gap junctions, tight junctions, and adherens junctions. We're going to identify, locate, and describe the function of the 4 different kinds of tissues, which involves identifying and describing the 8 different types of epithelial tissue, and identifying the 3 layers of skin, identifying and describing the 2 types of glands. We're going to identify and describe the various types of connective tissue, list and characterize the 3 different types of muscle tissue, and then finally name and describe the 2 different types of nerve tissue. Then we're going to learn how to apply the anatomical direction terms and be able to recognize and describe the various body cavities. And then finally, we'll identify the body's 11 organ systems. Section 5.1, cells are the building blocks of tissues. And here are the 4 different types of tissue. There's epithelial tissue, which covers the body, lines all cavities, and composes the glands. There's the connective tissue, which connects the structures of the body, providing structural support and holding organs together. This tissue is generally stretchy and strong and helps to maintain the body's integrity. The muscular tissue provides movement and produces heat. And then finally, the nervous tissue responds to the environment by detecting, processing, and then coordinating information so that we can respond to incoming stimuli. Okay, now we're just going to jump right into cell junctions. And I don't anticipate you needing to know any more than what's on this slide as far as junctions go. Anyway, junctions knit cells firmly together. They stop leaks, and they can serve as communication channels. The first junction that we're going to cover are tight junctions, and these block leaking between adjoining cells as they are impermeable, which simply means substances can't cross them, as opposed to permeable. There's the adherens junction, which is linked to the cytoskeleton inside the cell. It cements cells together, but is still flexible, so there isn't as much rigidity as you would expect. And then finally, there's the gap junction, and we went over these before. These are channels that connect the cytoplasm of neighboring cells, such that they are a fusion of both cell membranes, and they allow molecules and other substances to cross between the 2 connected cells. And gap junctions are abundant and smooth in cardiac muscle, and they allow cardiac muscle or heart muscle to contract in unison, which is very important, and we'll talk more about it in chapter 12. Now we're going to begin to talk about the different types of tissue, starting with epithelial tissue, which is generally a tissue that lines other tissues within organs. Anyway, this tissue is composed of cells laid together in sheets, such that cells are connected together very strongly, and this helps hold the cells together. One side of the cells in epithelial tissue is oriented toward the surface of the tissue, either the body cavity or external environment, and this would be the case of the skin. And this surface epithelial tissue may have cilia or microvilli, and this would be the case in the lungs with the cilia and in the small intestines with the microvilli. In all epithelial tissue, there is a basement membrane, which is a deeper connective tissue layer, It's acellular, which means it's not made up of cells. It is instead composed of a bunch of different molecules and is a collection of polysaccharides and proteins. Epithelium is actually little more than cells connected together. There are no blood vessels or any extracellular substances between the cells, mostly because how could there be when they're so tightly packed together? Epithelial tissues are identified by, both the number of cell layers and the shape of the cells in the upper layer, and we'll talk about this in more detail here in a second. Here's an image of the 3 layers of skin, which I've pretty much just placed here simply because skin is the first body organ that you think of when considering epithelial tissue. And this picture isn't in your book, and the reason I picked it is because it actually shows the 3 different layers of skin with their current names. So we have the epidermis, or the top layer of skin, the dermis, or middle layer of skin, which contains the blood vessels that allows the tissue to feed the actual living skin cells, and that's what's contained in the dermis. And then there's the hypodermis, which is the lower layer, which actually contains a lot of fat. And usually the hypodermis is called the subcutaneous layer, but that's actually not all that accurate of a name. So now it's called the hypodermis, and that's what we're going to call it in this class. Now we're going to talk about the naming scheme that's used to name the epithelial tissue. And there are 8 total types of epithelial tissue. Anyway, in order to name epithelial tissue, we must first identify how many layers of cells there are. We use the word simple for 1 layer of cells, and usually this type of epithelial tissue would function as a diffusive and absorptive membrane. If there are many layers of epithelial cells, we apply the word stratified, and usually these sorts of epithelial tissue are designed for protection. And then we use the word pseudostratified, which actually literally means not stratified or falsely stratified, when we have what almost looks like more than 1 layer of cells, or where it's a kind of a close call between 1 and 2 layers of cells, I suppose. And these sort of epithelial tissues are good for diffusion and absorption. And then, after we figure out how many layers of cells, we identify the cell shape. We use the word squamous for flattened cells, which are tapered at either end, and these usually make up diffusive membranes. We use the word cuboidal if the tissue contains cube-shaped cells, or we use the word columnar for column-shaped cells. And these are basically a longer form of cuboidal cells. And both cuboidal and columnar shaped cells in the epithelial tissues compose mucous membranes, in which the cells of the epithelium secrete mucus and other compounds. And then over here down by itself, we have a very special term that we apply to multiple layers of cells which are capable of contracting and expanding, and these cells are called, or this tissue is called, transitional epithelial tissue. And this is the sort of tissue that makes up the bladder and allows it to stretch without bursting. So these types of cells or tissue is basically a stretchy but very strong tissue. When we put the terms from the last slide together, we end up with 8 different types of epithelial tissue, and you're going to be responsible for learning each of these. There's simple squamous, which is found in the inner linings of the lungs. There's stratified squamous cells, which are found in the skin. We have simple cuboidal cells, which make up the epithelial linings of the kidneys. Stratified cuboidal cells make up the lining of the salivary duct. Simple columnar epithelium is the epithelium in the digestive organs. We have stratified columnar epithelium in the mammary ducts. There is pseudostratified columnar epithelium in the trachea, and like I said, transitional epithelium makes up the urinary bladder. Here's a picture out of your book that shows the 8 different types of epithelial tissue, which you can use to study for tests and quizzes. And I was just going to point out before we finish up with epithelial tissue, just remember that it's the tissue that lines things. It lines organs within your body, and it lines the outside of your body, as is the case with the skin. So just remember that it is the tissue that lines things. Okay, I take back what I said in the last slide. We're still not done with epithelial tissue. This is actually the last slide on epithelium. Glands are made up of epithelial tissue. Glands are composed of epithelial tissue and are classified by how their secretions are released. And glands are just organs in the body which secrete substances. So there's the exocrine glands, and these are glands that secrete into ducts or tubes. And these ducts direct the secretions to the surface of the gland where it can be released. An example of exocrine glands are salivary glands, sweat glands, and mammary glands. And then there are the endocrine glands, and these are glands that have no ducts. They secrete their substances, or rather secretions, directly into the extracellular fluid surrounding the gland cells. And usually these glands secrete hormones, which are picked up by the bloodstream and carried throughout the body. And many examples of these are internal glands, like the adrenal glands, which are above the kidneys, the thyroid gland, which sits pretty much right above the clavicle, and the pituitary gland. You only have one, and it's in the brain. Moving on to connective tissue, which binds, supports, and anchors the tissues and organs of the body, and is the most abundant type of tissue in the body. All connective tissue includes cells which produce protein fibers, and these cells are called fibroblasts. And they all connective tissue contains cells that store fat, and these are called adipocytes. And all connective tissues have cells which patrol the tissues for foreign invaders, and these cells which do that are called macrophages, excuse me. And we'll talk way more about macrophages in the future. All connective tissue is composed of cells suspended in a non-cellular or non-living matrix. And each type of connective tissue has a different type of matrix, and this matrix can be liquid as what is found in blood, and yes, blood is a connective tissue. It can be, or the matrix can be gel-like or solid, depending on what sort of cells are contained within the connective tissue. And connective tissue contains fibers of collagen for strength and elastin for flexibility as it stretches and recoils back to its original shape or position. Now we're going to talk about the different types of connective tissue. I didn't bother to actually count how many types there are, because honestly to count them would be a little confusing in this case, but you can try to count them yourself if you want to. Anyway, soft connective tissue has a matrix composed of a semi-fluid substance and also contains fibroblasts, which secrete the fibers needed for the matrix, and it contains white blood cells or leukocytes, and this would be referring to the macrocytes that we talked about, because they are a kind of leukocyte, and these help fight infection and patrol the matrix for foreign invaders. And there are 3 types of soft connective tissue, classified according to how they are arranged. So there is the loose connective tissue, or another name for this is the areolar connective tissue, which is basically just Latin for a lot of space. And this is found in the skin and some tissues of the breast, among other things. Then there's the dense connective tissue, which actually is 2 different types. There's irregular dense connective tissue, which is found in the skin also, and this really kind of just attaches the skin to an underlying tissue, like maybe a tissue that's part of the muscle. And then there's the regular dense connective tissue, and this is found in tendons. And remember that tendons are at the ends of muscles, and they connect muscles to bone. And I'd also like to point out, just backtrack a little, that loose connective tissue is also found in the skin and in adipose or fat tissue. And then finally there's elastic connective tissue, which is made up of freely branching elastic fibers with fibroblasts, and an example of an organ that contains this type of tissue is the heart. And we'll talk about that more in the next slide. Now here are some pictures taken from your book of the different types of soft connective tissue. So over here at your far right, or excuse me, left, we have an example of dense regular connective tissue, as is found in the tendons, and you can just see that these line up in a fairly regular and organized way. And your book doesn't have a picture of dense irregular connective tissue, so we're just going to have to assume that it's less organized and it's found in the skin. And then another type of connective tissue is the loose connective tissue, and this is found in the skin also, and you can just see that it's pretty unorganized, and the fibers aren't as tightly packed as what's found in the dense regular connective tissue. And then we have finally the elastic connective tissue, which is found in the heart. And of course the heart would need elastic connective tissue just because of all the beating it does. So naturally they would have to have stretchy fibers in their matrix to allow for this. Cartilage is a specialized type of connective tissue and is unique simply because it is avascular, and this means that it doesn't have any blood vessels buried within it. And the cartilaginous cells in the body are called chondrocytes, and they secrete a gel-like matrix which they secrete around them such that it eventually imprisons them. And this segregates them from direct contact with one another or any nutrient supply. And obviously when you don't have blood going into a tissue, it's not going to have a nutrient supply, because that's what the job of blood is. And this means the cartilage heals slowly, because in order for it to get matrix, as there aren't any blood vessels, the nutrients diffuse through the matrix to the chondrocytes, which of course would take longer than just receiving it directly from a blood vessel. And each chondrocyte actually resides in a small lake within this matrix, and this is called a lacuna. And there is a fluid within this lacuna, which would explain why we're thinking of it as a lake, which bathes the chondrocytes, and this is able to cross the matrix. There are actually three types of cartilage. There's hyaline cartilage, which has a matrix which contains many collagen fibers, which means that it's a very strong type of cartilage. And this looks crystal blue in living tissues. And this is the cartilage which is found at the end of bones and in the nose and in your trachea. And hyaline cartilage is capable, or rather does, ossify over time or over the course of an animal's development. And the word ossify just means to turn to bone, so this cartilage eventually turns to bone in some places. There's elastic cartilage, which contains many elastic fibers in its matrix, which means it is very bendable but doesn't break. And this, of course, allows for the outer ear to bend and is also present in the epiglottis. And the epiglottis is pretty much just an organ which keeps food from going into your trachea and going into your lungs. And then finally there's fibrocartilage, which is packed with collagen fibers, and this gives it extra strength, as with hyaline cartilage. And this is actually the cartilage which cushions joints such as the ones in your knee, and it's also makes up the discs between the vertebrae in your back. Anyway, after this slide, things are going to get a whole lot simpler because we're not going to have as many of these subtypes. Here are some pictures from your book of the three different types of cartilage. And over here at your left is hyaline cartilage, which in addition to being present at the ends of bones and in your nose, is also what fetal and infant bones are made up of before they solidify into bone, or another word for that is ossify, like I said earlier. And then there's elastic cartilage, which is found in your ear, and this of course contains elastin fibers, which is what makes it stretchy and, well, not so much stretchy as bendable. And then finally there's fibrocartilage, which cushion joints in the knee and also the joints in the neck, or the areas between vertebrae rather. And these of course are also very strong due to the fact that they contain a lot of collagen. Bone is another type of specialized connective tissue, and this is of course the hard mineralized tissue found in the bones of the skeleton. And bone cells are called osteocytes, and these secrete an osteoid or bone-like substance which eventually hardens and surrounds the cell in an ossified or hardened matrix. Cells within the bone remain in contact with one another through small channels called canaliculi, and these cells are also contained within lakes called lacuna, as with the cartilaginous cells. And bone has a lot of collagen fibers in the matrix because they're strong, like I said, but they're also flexible, so we have a kind of flexible support in the bones. And the reason why children generally have or don't break their bones as easily as adults is that, well, for one, they might have more cartilage than bone in some cases, as with infants, but children also have more collagen in their bones, which makes their bones more difficult to break than an adult's bones. Here's a picture from your book which shows a cross section of bone, and if you look over here to your far right, you can see the bone cell or osteocyte itself within the lacuna, And you can see the canaliculi, which connect the various lacuna in the bone cells. And then, of course, surrounding the bone cells, you have a calcified extracellular matrix which completely surrounds the bone cells or osteocytes. Blood and lymph are two other types of connective tissue, and lymph is pretty much just the fluid which is found in your lymph nodes, and we'll talk about it in much more detail in Chapter 8. And they are considered fluid connective tissue because they obviously have a fluid matrix. And the fluid matrix in blood is called plasma. And within this fluid matrix of plasma are three types of cells. There are the red blood cells, or erythrocytes, and erythro just means red, and cytes means cells, so we have red cells. And that's the name we're going to start calling them by from now on. And these cells carry oxygen. Then there's the white blood cell, or leukocytes, and leuko, of course, means white. And these are cells of the immune system, and they help to take care of foreign invaders in the body. And then there are platelets, or thrombocytes, as we're going to call them from here on. And these are, of course, the cells involved in blood clotting. And like I said, we'll talk way more about all of these things in Chapter 8. And lymph is derived from the interstitial fluid, or the fluid which bathes cells, or which cells are bathed in. And lymph is collected in the lymphatic vessels, like I said. And lymph actually includes cells as well as proteins and other compounds in its fluid matrix. And that's really probably the full extent of what you'll need to know about lymph for this chapter, simply because we're going to cover it way more in the following chapters. I suppose the title of this slide is a little misleading because we're pretty much just looking at blood here. But anyway, here's some pictures of the various cells in the blood. So we have the erythrocyte, or red blood cell, the leukocyte, or white blood cell, and then these ones that are kind of purpley looking are platelets, or thrombocytes. And here over to the right we have just a picture from under a microscope of these cells. And then there are two different types of leukocytes. There are neutrophils and monocytes, and these aren't the only types of leukocytes. We'll talk more about the different types later. Just know that there's more than one type of leukocyte. And then the fluid between all these cells is the blood plasma. And then the most numerous type of cell in the blood, obviously, is the erythrocyte, or red blood cell. And then we have these little kind of hard to see purpley dots in here, which are platelets or thrombocytes. So the last type of connective tissue we're going to talk about is adipose tissue, which is also a specialized type of connective tissue. And in this tissue we have fat cells, or adipose cells, or rather adipocytes, and these are the cells which are specialized for lipid or fat storage. And the adipose tissue does not have an extensive extracellular matrix because the matrix is a soft network of fibers which loosely hold the cells together and bind them to the supporting tissues. And the adipocytes, or adipose cells, actually swell as they take in more fat droplets, and thus when they do swell, the matrix can't stretch as far, so we get more densely packed fat. And the different stretching capacities of the two components of adipose tissue versus the matrix actually help to form dimples on the skin, And these aren't the dimples on your face, obviously. This is what we call cellulite, which are bumps on the skin which indicate where the adipose matrix is connecting to the skin. And this is kind of more of a problem of older women, but here we are talking about it anyway. And here's a picture from your book of the adipose tissue surrounding the heart. And yes, we need fat on our heart because it helps protect and cushion the heart. Anyway, here you can see the fat storage area of adipocytes is this big old white part within the cell. And here you can see the nucleus the nuclei are these little black dots. And they don't have much cytoplasm because it's just kind of in between the adipose storage area and the cell membrane. And then it points out the blood vessels in the adipose tissue and the plasma membrane. Moving on to the third type of tissue, the muscular tissue. And the function of the muscular tissue is to contract. And to contract simply means that the cells bunch up and get shorter, which allows for the generation of force. And when muscle cells or muscle tissue rather, is stimulated, the cells contract in unison. And here are the three types of muscle tissue. There is skeletal muscle, which is the type of muscle we usually think about when we're talking about actual muscles which allow our bodies to move. There's smooth muscle, which makes up the organs of the digestive tract. And then there's cardiac muscle, which is only found in the heart. Skeletal muscle tissue is composed of several very long multinucleate cells. And multinucleate just means that one cell has many nuclei contained within it. And the skeletal muscle tissue itself has visible striations due to the parallel arrangement of the long muscle cells. And a striation is simply a series of parallel lines, which you can clearly see in the picture at your right. The cells of skeletal muscle extend the length of the whole muscle and are arranged into parallel groups called fascicles. And we'll see what these look like in the next slide. Skeletal muscle allows you to move your limbs and stabilize your trunk, which allows you to stand up. And skeletal muscle is a voluntary type of muscle. In fact, it's the only voluntary type of muscle, which means that you can consciously control muscle contractions to control your own movement. And of course, the muscle tissue in your digestive tract is smooth muscle, and we can't control this muscle, so therefore we can't tell our digestive organs to digest. And cardiac muscle is involuntary and found in the heart, and this is the reason we don't have to tell our heart to contract. And of course, if we had to send a conscious thought to our heart to contract every time it needed to contract, we couldn't live like this, so that's why that muscle is involuntary. Here we have a diagram of skeletal muscle. I'm not sure if I got this from your book or not, but anyway, it clearly shows what a fascicle is, and you can see that it's just this little bundle of muscle cells which are wrapped up in a wrapping that we'll call the paramecium, and then these fascicles themselves are further wrapped up in the epimecium to create the whole wrapped up muscle here, which then connects to the bone by way of the tendon, which is pretty much just an extension of the epimecium or the wrapping around muscle cells. And you can clearly see a lot of this if you ever cut a steak apart. You can clearly see where these fibers are. Smooth muscle tissue is composed of cylindrical cells which are tapered at either end, and as opposed to skeletal muscle cells, they only have one nucleus. And this type of muscle tissue is found in the digestive system and in the blood vessels. And these are not striated and are not under voluntary control. And we obviously don't need to consciously tell our digestive system muscles to contract and blood vessels to dilate. So it's very helpful for it to be involuntary. And when you compare smooth muscle cells to skeletal muscle cells, you can kind of think of them as being a lot lazier than skeletal muscle cells because they don't have to work quite as hard. They can just kind of contract to push your whatever you're digesting through your digestive tract. The third and final type of skeletal muscle tissue is the cardiac muscle. And this tissue contains short, branched, striated cells with only one nucleus at the center of each cell. And you can see how these cells are arranged over in the picture at your right. Cardiac muscle tissue contains junctions called intercalated discs, which facilitate the heartbeat by transmitting the impulse, or rather the nerve signal, to contract. And these cells in the heart have gap junctions between them, which closely knit the cells together, and this helps to spread the contraction impulse through the cardiac tissue, and also binds the cells together, obviously. And this muscle is involuntary, like I said, such that we don't need to send a conscious thought to our heart to make it beat, which is, of course, very helpful. The fourth and final type of tissue is the nervous tissue, which acts as the body's phone and computer system. It's called a very irritable tissue because it responds to changes in the environment very readily, which is a property that we want. And there are two different types of cells within nervous tissue. There are the neurons and the neuroglia cells, and these can just be called the glial cells, and that's what they're going to be called in this diagram on the next slide. Here's a picture of a neuron and the neuroglia cells, or glial cells, and I hope you can understand what I'm saying when I say that word. And anyway, most of this picture is of the neuron, which is this big, long cell, which contains three parts: the cell body, which is where the nucleus is, and then the dendrites, which are branches off of the cell body, and then this long branch off of the neuron cell is called the axon, and the very end of the axon is called the axon terminal. And then we have glial cells, which secrete myelin around the axon, and we'll talk more about these glial cells around, or that surround the axon with a substance called myelin, later on in the next module. And then we have some other types of glial cells up around the cell body of the neuron. And we're going to talk about these types of cells in much more detail in the next module. Let's talk about the neuroglia first. And these are actually the supporting cells of nervous tissue glia actually means glue. And I'd just like to make it clear that these are not the cells that send or receive electrical impulses. And there are several different types of these neuroglial cells, and each of them has a specific supporting role. They can improve nutrient flow to the neurons, provide physical support to the neurons, remove debris, and act as electrical insulation. And we're going to cover this in much more detail in the next module, like I said. Now I'm going to tell you the difference between nerves and neurons, and there is a difference. Nerves are clusters of neurons, and their projections sheathed or covered in connective tissue, and these are part of the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, excuse me. And the PNS contains sensory nerves, which conduct sensory messages from the body's sensory organs to the spinal cord and brain. And when I say sensory organ, we mean something like eyeballs, or your nose, or your ears, or your tongue. And then the motor nerves carry impulses which cause muscular contraction or lead to granular secretion, and these impulses are carried from the spinal cord to the specific muscles and glands that are going to perform the specific task. And basically the peripheral nervous system is all the nerves to the side of your spinal cord in your body. And then neurons are what nerve cells are called in the central nervous system, which contains your brain and spinal cord. And the neurons here, or nerve cells here, receive and integrate or interpret information and then stimulate motor neurons to fire so that you can react to a specific stimulus. Moving on to section 5.2, finally. I know the first section covered approximately 30 slides. And this section is the organization increases with organs, organ systems, and the organisms. And just a real quick review of the hierarchy of life. So at one end, on the simple side of things, we have atoms and molecules, organelles and cells. And then about in the middle are the tissues. And after that, things get to be more complicated. We have organs, which are composed of two or more tissues, and then several organs together are called an organ system. And all of these organ systems work together in an organism. And that's the complex end of things. Just to enforce what I said in the last slide, an organ consists of two or more tissues, which you can see a diagram of the four tissues in the stomach to your right. So it contains epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. And an organ system is a set of several organs which carries out a major body function or functions. And the individual organism is the ultimate level of biological organization. And after this, we start getting into interactions between two or more organisms, which isn't really a concern of this class. Now we're just going to identify the 11 different organ systems in the human body. There's the integumentary system, which provides protection, helps to sense the immediate environment, and also produces vitamin D within the cells of the skin. There's the skeletal muscle system, which provides movement protection and also mineral storage, heat production, and blood cell production. And we'll talk about the integumentary system later on in the chapter, covering the immune system, because it is part of the immune system, even though it's kind of just an organ all its own, or an organ system all its own. And we're not really going to cover the skeletal muscular system, just because it's more or less self-explanatory, and if we go any farther with it, things will start to get more complicated. We also don't really have enough time to cover it with all the other things we have to cover. We have the nervous system, which we're going to cover in the very next module. And the main functions of this system is that it receives and reacts to external and internal stimuli, and also integrates or interprets the sensory information. We're going to cover the cardiovascular system. The main functions of this system is that it transports blood, which contains nutrients, wastes, and dissolved gases, to and from the tissues and throughout the body. We're going to cover the respiratory system. The main functions of this system are that it brings oxygen into the body and removes carbon dioxide from it, and also helps to maintain blood pH. We're going to cover the urinary system, which functions to maintain fluid balance and blood volume, and also composition and pressure of the blood and fluid volumes. We're not going to cover the endocrine system. We're going to talk about it when we cover all the other organ systems, though, because it has a role in all other organ systems. And the main functions of this system are that it produces hormones, which control events such as blood sugar levels, growth of an organism, and the growth of an organism to where it's sexually mature. We're going to cover the digestive system. The main functions of this system are that it absorbs nutrients, vitamins, and minerals from the food that we eat. We're going to cover the lymphatic system, or the immune system is what the actual module is called. And the main functions of this system is that it provides immunity and cleanses interstitial fluid. And then finally, in one of the last modules, we're going to talk about the reproductive system. And the main functions of this system is that it produces the gametes, or eggs and sperm, and is responsible for the secondary sexual characteristics, and provides for the development of the embryo and fetus inside of the body of the mother. Section 5.3, Scientists use a roadmap to the human body. Scientists actually have a precise system to name the structures of the body, but in order to do this, they must first put the body in anatomical position, which in humans is standing up straight with your palms outward. And they use these directional terms to talk about the relative positions of the various parts of the body. So proximal means near the core of the body, distal is farther away from the core of the body, superior is above, inferior is below, lateral is near the side, and medial is near the middle. Here's a diagram of the various parts of the body and what they're called, but we're just going to focus on the directional terms here. So up here at the top of the shoulder, we have the term proximal, which means that it's closer to the core of the body. And this is a relative term because it's the opposite of distal, which means farther away from the body. And then up at the top of the woman's head, we have the word medial, which is a term used to mean the middle of the body. And then lateral is used to describe the position at either side away from the middle. And then, of course, superior is towards the top and inferior is towards the bottom. The body has two large cavities, or cavernous regions, which contain the internal organs. The ventral cavity is what comprises the entire ventricle or belly aspect of your torso, which is kind of confusing because it also comprises your chest also. And the chest cavity is called the thoracic cavity, and this contains at least three different cavities. There's the pleural cavity, which surrounds each lung and has a serous membrane called the pleura, which makes up this cavity. And pleura is a word used to describe anything involving the lungs. Then there's the pericardial cavity, which surrounds the heart, and the membrane that makes up this cavity is called the pericardium. And then there's the mediastinum, which contains the heart, so it obviously contains the pericardial cavity within it. And it also contains the thymus, the esophagus, but not all of the esophagus, the trachea, and several large blood vessels. And then there's the abdominopelvic cavity, which is divided into two different cavities. The abdominal cavity contains the stomach, spleen, liver, gallbladder, small intestine, and most of the large intestine. And the pelvic cavity contains the urinary bladder, the internal reproductive system, and part of the large intestine. And then the second type of large cavity of your body is the dorsal cavity, which is really just one continuous cavity, but we like to differentiate between the two portions of this cavity. So we have the cranial cavity, which contains the brain, and the spinal cavity, which contains the spinal cord, and both of these are protected by membranes called the meninges. Here's a diagram from your book which depicts the body cavities, and I would recommend using this as a study aid. So it has the dorsal cavity in yellow with the cranial cavity at the top, which contains the brain, and the vertebral cavity, which contains the spinal cord. And then in blue we have the ventral cavity which contains the thoracic and abdominopelvic cavities, which we just talked about. And then we have the abdominopelvic cavity, which note is also part of the ventral cavity, and this includes the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. Here's the last slide, which contains a diagram of the abdominopelvic region of the body. And I don't think we're probably going to cover a whole lot of this on tests or anything, but just kind of be able to recognize which regions are part of this larger region. And it's just basic anatomy here. And like I said, I'm not sure how much we're going to get into this, but there might be a question or two over this diagram.